about as far as this slide when I ran out of time and speak to you earlier today. Anyway, so here we go then. So we talked about this idea that lions are particularly inefficient hunters because essentially they're pursuit predators. They chase their prey, which means they use an awful lot of their energy to catch their prey. And they're warm-blooded, which means that they use a lot of their energy just to stay at the right temperature. So that if I had 100 tons of zebra, I might get 5 tons of lions out at the end of it. No, 5 tons of lions, imagine that, never mind. So they're not particularly efficient hunters. Whereas something like, oh, I don't know what's going on here now. What's happening here now? Oh dear. Why can't I move the slide on? Oh, there we go, I can. So, whereas something like a lizard is a much more efficient hunter because they are ambush predators. They sit and wait and then they put out their big sticky tongue and catch the bugs. And they are cold-blooded. They don't use their metabolic processes to maintain their body temperature. They move into the heat. Cold-blooded is not a very good description, is it? Polchiothermic is the correct description, isn't it? So they're polchiothermic. They are the same temperature as the environment, or they might get a little bit above it by sunning themselves in particularly lovely spots. Anyway, I've got distracted. So this, you're going to get more predator per prey. So if I had 100 tons of bugs, I might get 20 tons of lizards out of it. So many years ago, I had the opportunity to go to look at the ecology of lizards in the West Indies. It was when I was at university. And we went to this island in the Caribbean where there are no vertebrate predators. There's nothing with a backbone other than humans and their crops. But basically it's an island of lizards. And the number of lizards was just extraordinary. There were lizards everywhere. And the reason why that's possible is that each lizard is quite efficient. The food chain is quite efficient because they're not tanking around all over the place and they're not trying to maintain their body temperature above the environmental temperature. So we can extend this idea into how we grow food, where what we want to do is to make each part of the food chain as efficient as possible. One thing we can do is we can stop limiting factors. It might be that the reason why the plants aren't growing particularly well is that there's not enough light, or it's not warm enough, or there's not enough water, or there's not enough soil, nitrogen, and phosphate. And we talked through this and we said, look, you can manipulate the light with artificial lighting. You can manipulate the temperature with a greenhouse or with artificial heating. You can manipulate the water with irrigation, and you can manipulate or improve the soil nitrogen and phosphorus with fertilizers. And then we said another reason why a food chain might be inefficient is respiration losses from the animals. So if I'm trying to grow meat, then I need to try to make sure that as much food as I put into the animals ends up as new animal as possible. And ways I can do that are to, if the animals are warm-blooded, to maintain their environmental temperature at a high value so they don't need to spend energy staying warm. So typically I'd use heat lamps in a chicken shed, or I'd keep pigs inside and keep them warm. I stop them from moving. Now clearly there are ethical problems with this. So chickens in battery cages might not be very good for individual chickens, but it's a very efficient way of converting chicken food into new chickens or new eggs. So I can limit their movement so they're not burning up energy and respiration loss. And then we also talked about the idea that generally humans eat it from the herbivore end of the food chain, not from carnivores, because by the time you get to the carnivore end of the food chain, there's so little of the original energy left that I'd require thousands of acres of land just to be able to support one carnivore. And where we do eat carnivores, we tend to eat cold-blooded carnivores like fish, not warm-blooded carnivores like lions. And then last but by no means least in this sort of slide, if you like, I can make the food chain more efficient by stopping the food from going somewhere where I don't want it to. So by stopping competition and by stopping predation and by stopping herbivory and by stopping parasitism. So a weed will compete with a plant for light and water. I can get rid of the weeds with herbicides, or I can get rid of the weeds by tilling techniques, by ploughing, by digging up the ground and stopping the plants from growing and then seeding the thing that I want to seed. I can get rid of parasites from my cows or my sheep or my pigs or my chickens by giving them worming tablets and killing off their internal parasites so that the food I put into the chicken is getting converted into new chicken, not into new parasite. And I can get rid of carnivores by excluding them, like we talked about, keeping your chickens in a shed. Or in a sort of historical basis, really, we've removed most of the carnivores from farming landscapes. So wolves are extinct in Britain. There were times when there were wolves in every part of Britain, but we hunted them to extinction because they competed with us for our sheep. Okay, that's that bit of the syllabus kind of done. I was hoping to finish it in the last video, but I've just run out of time. So after we looked at that, then we started looking at nitrogen, and we spent quite a lot of time looking at why nitrogen is important. And we basically said, look, there are three fundamentally important biological molecules that require nitrogen. Amino acids, which are the monomers for proteins, and proteins are the catalytic molecules. Most enzymes, nearly all enzymes, are proteins. Proteins are often the receptors for cell-to-cell signaling. Proteins are the control molecules that act to ensure that the right processes occur at the right time. Proteins are, of course, also part of the immune system, both from cell recognition and from antibodies. Proteins are used to move substances across membranes. They're used to establish the electrochemical gradients across nerves. They're used in ATP synthase. They're used for just about everything, aren't they? They're the great doing molecules. And then likewise, we cannot imagine life without ATP, because ATP is the short-term energy store for all life, and all catalytic or metabolic processes that require energy to make them work would get that energy directly from ATP. And remember, the reason why ATP is good for this is it releases a small amount of energy in a controllable way. And all living things use ATP. In fact, the fact that all living things use ATP is one of the pieces of evidence that all living things have a universal common ancestor, that we are all descended ultimately from one organism way back billions of years ago, and we are all inherited from that original organism using ATP as a short-term energy store. There is actually no really good energetic reason, chemical energetic reason why ATP is the short-term energy store. It's just we all inherited it from a common ancestor, but we all inherited it from a common ancestor. So without nitrogen to make ATP, again, we can't imagine living things as they are today. And then last but by no means least, we identified that nucleotides are the monomers for polynucleotides, and polynucleotides are the information storing molecules. And without polynucleotides, we cannot imagine being able to pass information or store information in a cell. So the recipes, if you like, for the primary structure of proteins are stored on polynucleotides. So without polynucleotides, we can't have any information storage, and without information storage, we can't have any protein synthesis. And again, it's impossible to imagine life without them. So evidence of why nitrogen is important to living things is molecular, but it's also experimental. So if we look in practically any habitat anywhere around the world, if I look at its net primary productivity, the amount of energy available to the herbivores per square meter per year, and then I look at its net primary productivity if I add nitrogen fertilizer, we can see that only in the case of deserts does it make no difference. So if I look at the ratio between NPP with extra nitrogen divided by NPP with natural nitrogen, we can see that adding nitrogen, the ratio is 1.19 for temperate forests. In other words, you get 119% of the growth with nitrogen as you do without it. And we can see the only habitat it makes no difference for is deserts, and you very sensibly suggested the reason for that is that there's just not enough water. I can add nitrogen until I'm blue in the face. It's not going to make any difference. So then we started looking at the nitrogen cycle, and I'll sort of spend the rest of this video basically going through this with you again. So the way to learn this is to do it step by step. And the first thing to do is to get your whiteboard and write these steps out. So ammonium ions, nitrite ions, nitrate ions, assimilates in plants, assimilates in animals, soil dead organic matter. Write them in a circle, rub it out, do it again, rub it out, do it again, rub it out, do it again, rub it out, do it again. Just keep doing it until you can do it. Also remember, in the exam it won't necessarily look like this, so practice writing it backwards. Write it anti-clockwise instead of clockwise. Write it with nitrate ions at the top, not ammonium ions at the top. Just do a few other ways so that you're not going to be befuddled by the fact the diagram doesn't look exactly like this. What's important is the order. It doesn't matter how you represent that order. So the order is ammonium ions are converted by a process. So this slide is showing processes called nitrification, and nitrification is an oxidation. And then nitrite ions are converted to nitrate ions by nitrification. It's an oxidation. We're adding oxygen to the ion to go from NO2 minus to NO3 minus. And then root uptake and assimilation, or amino acid synthesis. Plants take nitrate ions up through the water that comes up through their roots and into their xylem. And then those nitrate ions are used in processes in the cell to synthesize amino acids. Strictly speaking, the complexity of amino acid synthesis is not on your syllabus. We're not going to bother with it. You'd learn it at university if you decided to do this sort of thing later. So then the animals take in the nitrogen in the form of amino acids from the plants. I'm going to go back a stage, sorry. So the plant's uptaking and assimilating the amino acids. We've crossed a border. We've gone between nitrogen in the form of inorganic ions to nitrogen in the form of organic compounds. So the organic compounds are taken in the diet of animals. Everything eventually dies or gets pooped out, and it ends up as organic compounds in the soil. Now, whether it goes through the animals or directly from the herbivores to the soil, and we've talked quite a lot about why most plant matter doesn't get eaten. And if you think about what it's like in autumn when all those leaves fall off the trees, they haven't been eaten by anything. They're just falling off the trees and becoming part of the soil dead organic matter. And then in the soil, uncountable legions of bacteria and fungi break down the soil organic matter. And again, they're not doing it for their own good. Sorry, they're not doing it for the good of everything else. They're doing it because it's a source of a respiratory substrate. They're using the glucose and the fatty acids and the amino acids that are in the dead organic matter as a respiratory substrate for their own respiration to make their own ATP. And their waste product at the end of it is ammonium ions. Wrong button, still wrong button, there we go. So we've gone round in a circle. So your first thing to learn is the green boxes, the types of nitrogen. Your second thing to learn is the names of the processes, the grey thing. And again, just write it out, do it again, write it out, do it again. Do it round anti-clockwise. Do it with the assimilates in animals at the top. Do it with the assimilates at animals at the top and go round anti-clockwise. Just do every way you can imagine of doing it. What's important is the order, how it's represented isn't important and will change from exam to exam. Don't get too used to one diagram ever. Right, so the next step is to learn the names of the organisms that move it around the cycle. So they've all got stupid names which are hard to remember, which again is why the Anki app thing is useful, just to learn the vocabulary. So the organisms that convert ammonium ions into nitrite ions are a group of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria, because the process is nitrification. And they particularly belong to one genus called Nitrosomonas. You can see it's got a hideous spelling. If you were writing in an exam, you'd underline it to show that you understand that when it's printed, it's written in italics. If it's in an exam, it will be written in italics because it's the name of a genus. The Nitrosomonas convert ammonium ions to nitrite ions, and then another group of nitrifying bacteria called Nitrobacter, a genus called Nitrobacter, converts nitrite ions into nitrate ions. Now remember, they're not doing this for anybody else's good, they're doing it for their own good, and they are chemoautotrophs. They use the energy that's made available by the oxidation of ammonium and by the oxidation of nitrite to drive their own metabolic processes to synthesize ATP. And then from the synthesis of ATP, they then go on to synthesize glucose. So it's not photosynthesis, it's chemosynthesis. They're making glucose with the energy derived from another chemical process. Where they get the carbon from is another matter altogether. There's a really good exam question on it. We'll do it when we get there. So once you've got your nitrate ions in the soil, then the plants can take them up. Plants cannot directly use nitrite ions, and except for one group of plants that we'll get back to, they can't use ammonium ions either. So the plants take the nitrate ions up in the soil, and they, in their cells, by a process we don't need to know the detail of, they make amino acids, by which time it's an organic molecule, and then the animals take in the organic molecules. And then I don't need an animal for something to die, they just die. I don't need an animal for the leaves to fall off the tree, they just fall off the tree. So death, leaf fall, and herbivore ingestion don't really have an animal involved. Death and excretion don't really have an animal involved. So there we go. The last group are decomposing ammonifying bacteria. Now notice how many of these organisms are prokaryotes. So a relatively common question is describe the role of prokaryotes in the cycling of nitrogen. Okay, so notice that the ammonifying bacteria are lots of genera, plural of genus. So we don't bother giving them a scientific name because it would just be a huge list. We just call them all ammonifying bacteria. So your third job should be, job number one, write out the forms of nitrogen. Job number two, write in the processes. Job number three, write in the names of the bacteria. And if it's in red, you need to know it. So you need to know that Nitrosomonas is a nitrifying bacteria. You need to know there is another group of nitrifying bacteria called Nitrobacter. You need both names, nitrifying bacteria and Nitrobacter. All right, so the next slide, for some reason, repeats this one, so I'll just quickly whiz through it because it doesn't need to be there. It's a mistake. No, here we go. So this cycle then turns out to be connected to the atmosphere. And the reason why this cycle is connected to the atmosphere is actually almost all the nitrogen on the planet is actually in the atmosphere. And the reason it's in the atmosphere, and there's a slide later on that goes into more detail with this, but you're a chemist, you know this. The triple covalent bond in nitrogen has a massive bond energy. So, and an awful lot of energy is required to break all those bonds. So there's actually not many processes or organisms that can do it. So the way in and out of this cycle between the atmosphere and the nitrogen cycle is nitrogen comes out of the atmosphere into the nitrogen cycle by a process called nitrogen fixation. And there are groups of bacteria that can do that. And lightning does that, and the Haber process does that. And there are other groups of bacteria which take nitrate ions and nitrite ions, take the oxygen off them, which they use for their own uses. They use the oxygen as a terminal electron acceptor in electron transport chain in respiration. The denitrifying bacteria then going the other way. They're taking nitrate ions and nitrite ions from the soil, taking the oxygen off them and putting the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So denitrifying bacteria back the other way, nitrogen fixing bacteria atmosphere into cycle, and the nitrogen fixing bacteria are two genera that you need to know about: Rhizobium, which we'll go into some detail with in a minute, and and Azotobacter. Okay, so that's your next job, is make sure you can add those bits in. And what you need to add in, remember, is the name of the processes in black here, and then the names of the organisms in red here, with the additional idea that the whole cycle is connected to the atmosphere. Right, so now we're going to look at these nitrogen fixing bacteria in a bit more detail. And Rhizobium are quite an unusual group of bacteria because they form a mutualism with one family of plants. So family, remember, is species, genus, family, KP can offer, families, great stats can offer, order. See, I can't remember, I have to go through it as well. So it's that biological classification thing. So a family of plants might include tens or hundreds of species, and the family of plants we're interested in here are the legumes, and the legumes is actually a really big family. So apart from teaching biology students online, another one of my little jobs is I teach a plant identification course for the Botanical Society of the British Isles, and we've actually just got to legumes, and I was quite surprised by how big a family is. It's enormous. So there are hundreds of species of legumes, but they've all got this little trick where they live in mutualism with this bacteria called Rhizobium. Now, it's a neat trick for a plant because the Rhizobium is going to take nitrogen out of the air and make it available to the plant. So the plant's got its own private supply of nitrogen. It's got its own nitrogen factories. And it's a neat trick for a bacteria as well, because the bacteria gets what it needs out of the relationship. So I'll just read the text, right? So it says, bacteria in the genus Rhizobium are in a mutualism with plants from the legume family. Legumes include peas, beans, clovers, and vetches. You might not know what a vetch is, but I'm pretty sure you know what a pea, a bean, and a clover is, particularly because you've got a garden. So legumes basically provide something to the bacteria. So what they provide is anaerobic conditions. So in those root nodules, look how pink they look. The reason they look pink is they contain a protein called leg hemoglobin. And like hemoglobin, it absorbs oxygen, and the oxygen bonds to the leg hemoglobin. That takes the oxygen out of solution, which means that actually inside those root nodules, the cytoplasm of the cells inside those root nodules has very low available oxygen. Now that needs to happen because oxygen is a competitive inhibitor of the enzyme used by bacteria to convert nitrogen gas into ammonia ions. So the plant is doing one thing, it's providing this anaerobic environment that the Rhizobium needs to be able to survive. And then the second thing that the plant is giving to the bacteria is sugar. So the plant is making sugar in photosynthesis, it's being translocated through the phloem down into the roots and down into the root nodules, and some of that sugar is used directly by the bacteria as the bacteria's source of glucose for its own respiration. So if we think about then, okay, so that's what the plant is giving the bacteria. Well, what are the bacteria giving the plant? Well, what they're giving is they convert nitrogen ions into ammonium ions. Now remember how I said plants can't use ammonium ions? This is the exception. Legumes have then got another series of enzymes in their tissues that convert the ammonium ions into nitrate ions. Now that can't happen directly in the root nodule because the root nodule is a low oxygen environment, and we know you need oxygen to do it. So I'm going to try and avoid getting distracted any further with that and just say, forget that. All you need to know is the rhizobium makes ammonium ions, and then the plant converts the ammonium ions into nitrate ions. So it's a lovely little relationship. The bacteria gets anaerobic conditions which it needs and sugar, and the plant gets nitrogen in a form that it can use. Eventually it gets nitrate ions. The other group of bacteria that do nitrogen fixation, they don't live in root nodules. They live free in the soil, and they're called Azotobacter. And again, that's a genus because you can see that because it's got a capital letter and it's written in italics. So Azotobacter live free in the soil. Now remember, the soil is composed of lots of particles with gaps in between. And the Azotobacter are another one of these things that actually it's quite a tricky way to live. The Azotobacter are another anaerobic bacteria. Oxygen is poisonous to them. So they tend to live in the spaces in soils where there is no air. And remember, that tends to be really narrow spaces in soils where the water sticks to the soil particle and excludes the air. So in the top right picture, I've identified a little crack, if you like, between two soil particles, and that might be the sort of place that you get some Azotobacter living. And incidentally, this image is significantly magnified. In the bottom left-hand side, there's a much bigger gap. Now that much bigger gap is unlikely to be as full of water, which means there might be some air in it. And then those ammonium ions get oxidized into nitrate ions by the nitrifying bacteria. So in order for a soil that has Azotobacter in it to be useful to a plant, it needs to be that intermediate soil where if it's totally waterlogged, it's no use because it's making ammonium ions, and no plant can take ammonium ions up through its root hairs, even the legumes, because the ammonium ions aren't starting in the root hairs. The soil needs to have a combination of anaerobic conditions to allow the Azotobacter to survive, and aerobic conditions to allow the nitrifying bacteria to survive, which convert the ammonium ions, first of all into nitrite ions, and then into nitrate ions, where they're made available to the plant. Okay? I'm talking at 1,000,000 miles an hour, aren't I? I do apologise. All right, so there it is then. There's the beastie in itself then. That's the whole cycle with its denitrification and nitrification. And it turns out what goes on here, this balance between denitrification and nitrification, I've already mentioned this, depends on the oxygen conditions in the soil. So if the soils are anaerobic, if they're waterlogged, then oxidation can't happen and reduction happens, and denitrification is a reduction reaction. You're losing oxygen from molecules, and the soils tend to lose nitrogen. So the reason why those soils on the top of Exmoor aren't very good for growing anything on is that they're so wet because it rains up there so much that they're waterlogged, and the nitrogen cycle is going into reverse, and nitrogen is escaping the soils and going back to the atmosphere. In order for the ammonium ions to be converted to nitrite ions and nitrate ions and not to be lost, we need aerobic conditions. So we need air in the soil. So this is yet another reason why waterlogged soils aren't particularly productive. Apart from the fact there's not enough oxygen for the roots to respire, there's also not enough oxygen for the nitrification processes to occur, and instead we get denitrification or reduction processes occurring in the soil. Right. So you said this to me. You said lightning basically has an effect on the nitrogen cycle. You're exactly right. So what have I put in here? All right, here we go. So lightning and fertilizer in the nitrogen cycle. So we've seen from this table, sorry, I've got slightly ahead of myself. I'm going to do fertilizer first. So we've seen that nitrate availability is a limiting factor in almost all ecosystems. Incidentally, a really good test of whether something is a limiting factor or not is if you add more of it, does the process speed up? That's the best indicator of whether something is a limiting factor. So we can see that in all ecosystems that have been tested here, except for deserts, the addition of nitrogen speeds up the rate of photosynthesis because the net primary productivity is increased. That means that nitrogen is a limiting factor for plant growth in all these habitats except for deserts. So nitrogen availability is a limiting factor in all ecosystems except for deserts. And we get around that with the Haber process, which you'll remember from chemistry, is this process which forms ammonia from hydrogen gas and nitrogen gas. And I won't talk about the Haber process because I'll expose my terrible chemistry. And it's the first step in the manufacture of artificial fertilizer. And human use of artificial fertilizers tripled the concentration of nitrate ions in agricultural soils. Now, let's just stop and think what we're saying there. We've tripled the quantity of nitrate in agricultural soils. If I tripled the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, fires would start and never go out. if I tripled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, runaway global warming would practically sterilize the planet. It's an extraordinary change that's occurred really since the 1950s, where use of the Haber process has allowed us to add unimaginable quantities of nitrate to agricultural soils. It's actually quite a bad environmental problem, but let's get on with it. So then the other one is lightning, which you quite correctly identified. So there we go. Look, I said 2,000. It's not. It's 1,524 kilojoules per mole is the energy of the triple bond in diatomic atmospheric nitrogen, whereas the NO bond is 200 kilojoules per mole. So lightning has got sufficient energy to break the bonding and allow nitrogen to react with oxygen. So when lightning occurs, you get nitrous oxides form, which oxidize further in the atmosphere, eventually to produce nitric acid. The nitric acid dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a nitrate ion. Oh, look, there's a nitrate ion. That's what ends up in the soil. Right, that's it. That's the nitrogen cycle done. So I think I'll probably do the carbon cycle as well, because then that gets us to a sensible place in the syllabus, and the carbon cycle is much easier. So actually, before I go on, I'm just going to go back a bit and just explain, remember what you need to do here, right? So what you need to do here is basically get to the stage where you can essentially do that and add in that bit, right? So you want the entire nitrogen cycle basically stuck in your head, and it takes time and you have to write it out. And if you use the Anki app stuff, it'll definitely help, because there's each part of it is defined in the Anki app thing. But I would say where you want to get to is the stage where you can just pick up a whiteboard and write it out without any hesitation. And, you know, I'm not underestimating how much work that is. It's not easy. Okay, so what am I doing here? Going the wrong way, I think. Am I? No, I'm going the right way. Here we go. Here we go. Right, carbon cycle then. So you don't need to know too much about this, which is good, because you know, if you wanted to, you could pursue it for forever, and it turns out it's actually pretty complicated, but not in your syllabus, it's not. So what we're asking here is basically, where is the carbon? And the answer is, it's in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and then it gets transferred to the biosphere. So how does carbon dioxide go from the atmosphere into living things? And that is, of course, photosynthesis. And then it goes back by respiration. Whoops, try that again. Yep, goes back by respiration. So on a daily basis, carbon dioxide comes out of the atmosphere into plants. It's made into glucose. Most of that glucose is used in respiration straight away and goes back out. Some of it gets handed along the food chain and comes back out. But basically the carbon is moving between the atmosphere in an inorganic form into living things in an organic form. Photosynthesis is making the organic molecules. Respiration is dismantling the organic molecules and returning it to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've already covered the idea that basically most living things don't get eaten by animals. They just fall over and die in the soil. So death and excretion, is going to take carbon from the biosphere to the soil. And if you think about all those leaves that fall off all those trees in the autumn, it's a pretty clear representation. All those leaves are full of carbon. All that carbon ends up in the soil. Now, if it all ended up in the soil and stay there, we'd be buried in leaves by now. Of course, the leaves do break down. So decay is just a type of respiration. By bacterial respiration is another word for decay. The soil dead organic matter eventually breaks down. So on a yearly cycle, like the biosphere accumulates carbon from the atmosphere, and then in the autumn it dumps most of it into the soil, and then over a few years that soil dead organic matter is broken down and released back to the atmosphere again. And then if we look on slightly longer timescales, some of the soil dead organic matter doesn't end up back in the atmosphere. Instead, it gets buried by geological processes and it becomes a fossil fuel. It's fossilized. Now, over most of geological time, that's been a one-way process. Carbon has got buried from the biosphere into fossil fuels. But of course, what we do is we burn those fossil fuels and we return that carbon to the atmosphere. And I think the current estimate is that for every year we burn fossil fuels, we're putting something like 10 million years worth of fossilization back into the atmosphere again. So that's the global carbon cycle, and I'd suggest it's much easier than the nitrogen cycle, but again, you need to know it, write it out, do it again, write it out, do it again, write it in a different order. Don't use things in the same way, try that again. Don't put the boxes in the same place, write it out every way you can think of doing it. It's the processes and the links that matter. Exactly where you draw the boxes doesn't. Look, I'll move something just for fun. No, I can't. I'm not in that edit mode, right? All right. And then the other thing you need to know is basically how do things change day to night. So if I look at this graph, up the left-hand side is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Along the bottom is the time of day. 0 is midnight, 12 is midday. And what this is showing you is the balance between photosynthesis and respiration in plants. So this is in a forest in Denmark in 2005, where they've measured the carbon content in the atmosphere. And you can see that when the sun comes up, it's the middle of the summer, it's the 14th of July, it's not very far off the longest day. When the sun comes up about 5 in the morning, the plants start photosynthesizing. They're photosynthesizing faster than they respire. They pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and the atmospheric carbon dioxide level drops. And then for most of the daylight hours, from about 10 till about 6, the balance between photosynthesis and respiration is about the same, but the plants have taken loads of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and it's in the plant as glucose. And then as it starts getting dark, the balance goes the other way. Respiration starts to be faster than photosynthesis, so carbon is returned to the atmosphere and the atmospheric concentration goes up. Now this is just a very local event. They're measuring the carbon dioxide concentration probably directly above the trees or even in amongst the forest, and they're just measuring it over one day. And what you're seeing is the balance between photosynthesis and respiration changing depending on whether it's daylight or not. So I would describe those as diurnal changes, because diurnal changes means over a day, like weekly means over a week, or annual means over a year. Diurnal means over a day. So speaking of yearly changes in carbon dioxide or annual changes, here they are. So this is data that's from a station that measures atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations in Hawaii. The reason they pick Hawaii is it's so far away from any land mass that if you detect a change, that change is probably true of the average for the atmosphere and isn't just a localized effect because you've got a forest like you did in the last one. Each dot represents a day. Each red bar represents the average of a week. Each blue bar represents the average of a month. So if we look at what's happening here, we can see that from October onwards, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere gradually increases. So that by June, maybe late May or June, the amount of carbon dioxide, May it is, isn't it? By May, the amount of carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has peaked. And then from June to July to August to September, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere starts to decline. So the obvious question here is, well, why does it have this pattern? Why does it increase from October to May and then decrease from May to September and then increase from October to May? So we can imagine year in, year out this repeats. In fact, I'll just show you the next graph. Look, it repeats. See the red line? That's the up, down, up, down, up, down of that cycle there. So the answer is that, that if you look at a map of the world, the northern hemisphere has more land than the southern hemisphere. So what we're really detecting here is the effect of northern hemisphere seasonal growth. So in the northern hemisphere, from May to June to July to August to September, more carbon on average is coming out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis than is going back in by the combined effects of respiration from the biosphere and respiration from the soil. From May onwards, the opposite is true. The amount of carbon dioxide, got that wrong. From October onwards, the opposite is true. So for October, November, December, the winter months in the northern hemisphere, photosynthesis has declined because light levels have declined, and soil respiration is basically putting carbon back into the atmosphere faster than it's been pulled out. And I'll repeat again, the reason why, you know that it's when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, it's winter in the southern hemisphere. So the reason why they don't balance out is there's much more land in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. Just, look at Google Earth, look at the map, you don't need telling this. So that's a yearly change, and the yearly change is basically showing how different the influence of the northern hemisphere is over the southern hemisphere. And again, it's a balance. And in this thing, it's like how much is in the atmosphere is a balance between how much is being taken out by photosynthesis at one hand versus being put back in by respiration. It's mostly soil respiration that you're seeing the effect of here. And here's the same idea, carbon dioxide concentrations up the left-hand side, time along the bottom axis, but now I'm looking at much longer term changes. So the red line is showing the up, down of a seasonal change. Winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, and the effects of the northern hemisphere. But we can see that year in, year out, more carbon dioxide has gone back into the atmosphere than came out. And what we're seeing there is the effect of burning fossil fuels. So really from the late 1700s or early 1800s onwards, we've added more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than gets taken out by natural processes because we've burnt fossil fuels. You can see that this line is actually getting steeper. We're adding more every year than we did the previous year. And if we look at our diagram, what we're saying this time is that carbon dioxide being withdrawn from the atmosphere by photosynthesis is outweighed by carbon being returned by a combination of respiration and combustion. So here's an even longer term change. So this is over hundreds of thousands of years. Now, an obvious question is, I mean, this one, people have been measuring carbon dioxide since the 1960s. This one, how on earth does anybody know how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere 600,000 years ago? 600,000 years ago, we were running around dressed in animal skins, hitting each other over the head with stones. The answer is that the atmosphere gets trapped in ice when it falls as snow. Layer after layer of ice builds up, and in some parts of the world, like Antarctica, the ice is deep enough that if you drill a hole into it and pull the ice up, you get ice that was snow 600,000 years ago. Air bubbles trapped in the ice can then be used to work out what the carbon dioxide concentration is. Now, what we can see here is that there is a natural cycle in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that is linked to changes in the orbit of the planet, which in turn link to changes in the amount of sunlight coming in, which in turn link to changes in the amount of photosynthesis which goes on the planet. But if you look at year zero, which on this scale is like, you know, the last 100 years, because you can see that the bottom scale is showing lumps of 100,000 years. If you look at year zero, you can see that the amount of carbon dioxide has just changed just almost instantly. And that, of course, is the burning of fossil fuels. Now, the other thing you can see from this is that the modern increase, I'm just going to use the mouse to point where it is. Here it is over here, look. The modern increase in, and by modern, I mean geologically modern, because I'm the sort of weirdo that says that sort of thing. The modern increase is completely out of proportion to the natural cycle that's related to the planet's orbit and changes in photosynthesis. So that is the effect of humans putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is out of date now. We're over 400 now. It's actually up here now somewhere. Okay, this graph was made in 2005. Now, the last bit you need to know about the carbon cycle is that there is the potential for things to go really quite nastily and suddenly even worse than the situation that we're currently here. Please don't lose sleep over this, by the way. It's just a theory. It's not necessarily going to happen. Which is that there is another part to this carbon cycle that we've ignored, which is while there is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, it turns out that carbon dioxide is actually quite soluble in water. So the oceans are full of enormous amounts of dissolved carbon dioxide. When I say enormous amounts, there's something like 50 times as much carbon dissolved in ocean water as there is in the atmosphere. Now, it's a dynamic equilibrium. Every day, some of that carbon that's dissolved in the ocean waters evolves, which is the opposite of dissolves when we're talking about a gas, and comes back into the atmosphere. And every day, billions of tons of the stuff dissolves back into the ocean. So how much evolves and how much dissolves turns out to have quite an effect on how much is in the atmosphere, and it's all related to temperature. So if we look at the graph on the left-hand side, which is showing on the x-axis how soluble carbon dioxide is in water, so you can dissolve at 0 degrees centigrade, you can dissolve 0.36 grams of carbon dioxide in 100 millilitres of water. At 60 degrees centigrade, you can dissolve about 0.6 grams of carbon dioxide per 100 millilitres of water. The important point here is you can see it's an inverse relationship. The hotter the water is, the less carbon dioxide will dissolve. So the obvious possibility here is that climate change is going to get away from us. And the way it can get away from us is if we heat the environment enough that the oceans start to warm, and they are, carbon dioxide becomes less soluble in seawater, so it evolves faster than it dissolves. So the huge quantities of carbon dioxide that are dissolved in the oceans can come into the atmosphere and very quickly change the climate. Now, like I said, please don't lose sleep over this. This is a theory. It's not been proved to be happening. It's just one of those things that reminds you of why we really do need to worry about climate change, because there is the potential it could go an awful lot faster in the future. Now, this is an example of positive feedback. So remember, in positive feedback, a change occurs that makes future change more likely. So why it's positive feedback is the oceans get warmer, carbon dioxide becomes less soluble, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, that makes it warmer, that makes the oceans warmer, that makes carbon dioxide less soluble, that means more carbon dioxide comes out of the ocean into the atmosphere, that makes it warmer, and on we go. The initial change, an increase in temperature in the atmosphere, makes more change more likely, a mechanism occurs that adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and then drives the temperature up. Right, that is enough. Bye for now, see you Tuesday.